Well, welcome to today's webinar on strategies to reach and retain more people. My name is Sean, and I've been on the Unstuck team here since 2017. Currently, I serve as the Director of Consulting to help churches discover just the best step to address their headline challenges and then develop plans to address those issues. I'm also joined by my teammate, Amy Anderson. Amy has been on the team here at the Unstuck Group since 2015, and she currently serves in the role as Managing Director. During her time here, she's served more than 200 churches personally, helping them design ministry strategy, staffing, and multi-site plans to fuel their mission going forward. Amy, thanks for being here today and helping me host this conversation.
Of course, I love this topic. It's very personal to me. I've shared this on the webinars and on the podcast before, but back in 1998, my husband and I, we got invited to go to church with some friends, and we hadn't been to church in many years, and we came with very low expectations based on our church backgrounds. But from the moment we arrived, we knew that this church, this place was different. We were greeted by genuine people. They used language that made us feel both welcome and comfortable. We heard music that was relevant and well done. And of course, we heard a message from God's word that spoke to us and it applied to our lives. And that experience, well, it reached us, but not only that, we quickly got connected in community. We started serving. By the end of that first year, we were already tithing. And that whole experience completely transformed our lives. And that's my heart. That's what I want for all of our churches. I want us to create experiences that are just irresistible, and they get people connected to Jesus through the local church.
I love that. I think, Amy, about a friend of mine, actually, who came to the church I was working at about 15 years ago. He came in with his girlfriend one day, and they had two young kids together. They were newer parents, and they were kind of looking to get their kids connected in a local church at that point. I met him. We became friends. They started getting involved in the life of the church, which was really great. He eventually joined our band, playing guitar on Sundays. And one of the coolest things, I can distinctly remember the Sunday he's standing on stage playing guitar, and he looks up at the screen and he saw his then girlfriend, soon to be wife, getting baptized kind of spontaneously that day. It was awesome. And he was baptized soon after that. And over a number of years kind of grew to the place where he actually joined our team on staff. And I was so glad that our church created a place where people like him could come in, feel included, and then be challenged to take their next steps. Here's why we're talking about this today. You know, we consistently hear two similar-ish things from pastors. One, if they're reaching a lot of new people, they're looking for a better way to retain them, better ways to kind of engage them in the life of the church. And then two, if they're not reaching a lot of new people, they're looking for ways to get started, right?
Yeah, that's right. So today we're going to take a little bit different approach to the webinar. We're going to introduce you to two leaders from two great churches who have made specific shifts recently to do both of these things. And so we're going to let them share what worked for them, what started working for them. And then Sean and I will build on those learnings and share some best practices that we think you'll find helpful.
Yeah. So as viewers of the webinar today, here's the decision that we want to help you make. Depending on which issue you're trying to address, we hope that we can convince you to commit to trying one new strategy to reach and retain more people, specifically in the second quarter of this year. So we're going to talk through this conversation in two different sections. Part one is going to be on fully leveraging your big front door as a church. And then part two is going to be on retaining more people with the right next steps. So before we get started, just a couple other details to know. Of course, we have chat and live Q&A going. You can submit your questions in the Q&A function within Zoom. So if you push that Q&A button, you can submit questions there. Amy and I are going to try to address some of those at the end of today's webinar, but use chat for just the ongoing conversation throughout today's webinar, your observations, questions, and interaction with other viewers. If you haven't downloaded the workbook to go with today's webinar, you can get it at the unstuckgroup.com/workbook. Okay. theunstuckgroup.com/workbook. Last thing, you can share on social media if you're a social media person using X, formerly Twitter, or Facebook. Just tag us with the hashtag UnstuckChurch. Okay. So hashtag UnstuckChurch. Amy, so you said this earlier, but we wanted to kick off each section of this webinar by sharing a story from a real church. And then you and I are going to take some time and kind of discuss and react on that story and build on it with some best practices and ideas that other churches can integrate into that strategy. So can you tee us up for this first conversation on leveraging the big front door?
Yeah. Well, whether you've ever called your weekend service your big front door or not, it likely is. The weekend service, the 52 events that we have throughout the year, are still the primary place people explore faith and explore God. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen in other spaces, but the majority of people view the weekend services as the front door to exploring faith. It's what we invite to, it's where we plan for people to show up. This is the gathering that we're always trying to get people to. And because of that, it's really your primary reach strategy. So last year, I had the honor of working with a large church in Lafayette, Louisiana, called the Bayou Church. And I had met 4 of their leaders at one of our executive pastor cohorts. They were very sharp leaders. And out of that experience, they chose to engage Unstuck to help them with their staffing and structure. So as part of that process, I needed to understand how they did ministry because, of course, structure follows our ministry strategies. So Sean Walker, he is the lead pastor of the Bayou Church, and he's been in that role since 2020. And in our conversations about discipleship and reach strategies, a light bulb went on for him. As we were talking about the weekend being the primary strategy to reach new people, he made this connection, Sean, and in a new way, he made it about the purpose of the weekend. I could literally see it. I could see the clarity in his eyes. And the Bayou Church, by the way, has grown 70% over these past 12 months. Their online engagement has grown 24%. They're baptizing 9% of their average weekend attendance throughout the year. And by the way, the benchmark for that is 5%. So needless to say, the Bayou is reaching people. So I invited Sean. I wanted him to share some of their story with you related to leveraging the weekend to reach people. And again, after we hear from Sean Walker, me and my co-host Sean Bublitz will share some related best practices. So let's share that conversation now. Well, I'm here today with my friend Sean Walker. Sean, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Well, you initially reached out after being part of a cohort with Unstuck. And when I was on site with you, I recall our conversation when you made that connection about your weekend service being your main strategy to reach people. Do you remember that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think your response when we said that, it looks like your weekend is your main strategy to reach people. You just kind of paused and you said, guys, we have a Lamborghini and we're driving it like a Camry.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, I'd love to hear just kind of generally, what has been your approach with the weekend service, like how you want to reach new people through that experience? And then after that shift or that realization that this is your primary reach strategy, I'd like to hear just any changes that you've made as you've approached your weekend planning.
Absolutely. So again, I've grown up in the church. I've been around the church world forever, spent a ton of time studying the Bible, looked at different, church growth movements and followed along and learned a lot and discarded some things I didn't agree with and jumped in with other things I did. And I don't know where it came from, but I just had this false thought that I now realize was false, like that the premier and the only and the most honorable way to reach someone for Christ is a one-on-one, almost street evangelism style thing. And so like that is the most important, it's the most honorable way. And I had kind of let what God was trying to put in my lap kind of slide. And not that, look, I'm all for it. I've led people to Christ. I'm actively sharing the gospel with people. It's beautiful. I'm not trying to put it down at all. But what was happening was I was unintentionally putting down the opportunities that were right before me on a Sunday morning. And so when you were on site and we were working on some staff reorg things and talking about future vision, and you made, you talked about how Sunday morning is such a high potency opportunity for reaching people. And that's when God gave me that image of, like someone who's scared, driving a Lamborghini in a school zone, or like just doing 5 miles an hour. It's like, no, this is a Lamborghini. This thing was designed to go. That's when it clicked. I was like, oh my goodness. Sunday morning is like right in front of us, and we're not like pulling and capturing the opportunity that's right before us. I mean, think about an outreach event. Like if I were to, as your listeners I'm sure have done, if I were to do an outreach event, it would take weeks, if not months, of planning and theming and communicating and inviting and logistics to do an event. We are already doing that every single Sunday morning. Like we don't have to reinvent the wheel and recreate all this momentum. People naturally, their most likely time to go to church is on a Sunday. As we see in statistics, that most people are just waiting for someone to invite them to go to church. Like it's there. We just need to make sure we're leveraging Sunday morning. Again, not only for reaching the lost, but why would we leave that on the table
Sure.
unseized? And so it's like, well, Sunday morning, like, yes, we have festivals in our community, and we've been a part of them with our tent, saying, hey, you might want to talk about God or the gospel. Those are great. We still do those, but that's naturally happening every Sunday morning. So why wouldn't we seize them? Let's I still disciple people to do functional street evangelism,
Hmm.
and we still do outreach events, but our primary, like we're now saying it out loud, our
Hmm.
primary reach tool, the one with the most potential and opportunity, is clearly Sunday morning. So let's be intentional about um, fully capturing that opportunity to reach people for Christ. So that's kind of like the why and the big picture.
Hmm.
What that we started, and we've started doing it in multiple ways on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, so that's the shift in the thinking. So tell me about some new things that you've done or tried as a result of that shift.
Yeah. Um, Clarifying it with your staff. You're right. If this is a win in my heart, but my people don't know it, then we're never going to get there, because it's not about Sean Walker's ability to get people on Sunday morning. It's about our entire church. So clarifying that win with the staff, clarifying that win with our serve team
Hmm.
members and with our church, like talking about it. Like one of the most kingdom shifting things you can do this week is sending a text to a friend who doesn't go to church.
Hmm.
Right? You don't, that simple tech. My wife is a believer because in high school, a friend of hers simply said, hey, you want to come to church with me come to church with me this Sunday? And my wife is an amazing follower of Christ. And it really boils down to God working through that humble friend with a humble invitation to just come to church.
Hmm.
And so communicating it clearly, hey, this is a win for us. This is what we're going to pursue. There are other priorities as well, but let's not miss this, the opportunity we have on Sunday morning. I would say the other probably biggest thing that I think has contributed to our growth is being strategic about what we preach when.
Good. Share more about that.
Yeah, so we know, and I would presume, you can confirm this or tell me it's off, but most churches, their two highest attendance seasons are going to be August back to school and January, New Year's resolutions time. Like I've got data that goes back 10, 20 years in our church that's when people are coming. And so actually picked this up from Andy Stanley a while back, and who basically said, we preach our all skates on those moments, because I know I've got an abnormal amount of guests, a high amount of guests. I'm going to preach it's not watered down. It's from scripture. It's powerful. It's relevant. It's just easily accessible for both the first time guest and the long time
Hmm.
believer. So as I'm thinking through my year and what I preach when, those August and January were very strategic. Like I'm not going to go preach some deep theology that's going to move longtime believers, but first time guests are going to be lost.
Yep.
That's for later in each semester. That's later spring and later fall. We still
Hmm.
teach those things, but January and August, we're preaching things that are easy for guests to understand and still helpful for
Hmm.
longtime believers. And so guess what? The first time guests enjoy it. They connect. They're like, oh, wow, I didn't know the Bible actually had things that would benefit my everyday life.
Hmm.
And here is the biggest thing that we do is in those seasons, I'll give you a perfect example. So Christmas, we do a a weekend of concerts. That's kind of like one of our unique contributions to the kingdom is our music. We've got an incredible worship pastor and creative arts team, and we'll see thousands of people come to our Christmas concerts. And for years, I thought, man, I need to share the gospel and give an invitation. I got all these people, like that's the most honorable, my seminary professor would be proud that you know what I mean? As if he's my target. And so I remember wrestling with this idea with Carol Mills, our now retired executive pastor. I was like, Carol, every Christmas in front of thousands of people, we're preaching the gospel. And yes, we're seeing, a handful of people give their life to Christ, but like it's a holiday season. People are, it's a busy time. They're not in the headspace to fully grasp the gospel. My sermon's 10 minutes long because it's a concert. They're not in the headspace to understand fully the gospel. What if we gave them a next step that was more likely for them to accept? And so I still share the gospel, but I then make my ask. Hey, here's my ask. Would you just come to the Bayou for 4 Sundays starting in January?
Perfect.
Just come for 4. If you don't like it after that, you have honored me and gifted me, and I consider myself blessed. But would you come for 4 Sundays? So while we had a small response to, are you ready to give your life to Christ? We had this gigantic response of people who were like, okay, yeah, I'll try it for 4 weeks. And my favorite moment this past Christmas, we're people are coming in, and I passed through our main doors, and one of our serve team members was handing out guides, and she stopped me, said, "Hey, Sean, I'm one of the people you asked last Christmas concert to come for 4 Sundays."
Wow.
And I just hugged her and I said, man, I'm so proud of you. Thank you obviously you've come for more than 4. She's now given her life to Christ. She's plugged in. She's been through we call it First Steps, our growth track, new members, class. And she's now serving at the next year's Christmas concert.
Amazing.
And so again, sometimes I can try to force what I want them to ultimately do for them to do immediately. But instead, we're being strategic about what is their next step. And if it's an accessible, understandable, not too big of a next step, they're more likely to take it. So switching our invite, and I do the same thing in August. Like, hey, if you're checking the Bayou out, just come for 4 Sundays. Just try it out and see. And so many end up taking us up on that invitation and jumping in.
Well, and I love how you leveraged one of the 52 events you have, or 4 of the 52 events you already have on your calendar to invite them to. And here's what I know, churches like you and several other that I've been working with, this flywheel of the invite culture is churning, meaning you have done things that have created a predictably safe environment to invite my friend to. And the rest of your vital signs show the life change that's happening.
Yep.
All right, Pastor Sean, as we wrap up, you've got a lot of pastors tuning into today's webinar. Any final thoughts you want to share with them related to reaching new people with your weekend service?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that totally shifted the game for me was when I had been inviting a guest, and I happened to not be preaching the Sunday they said they were going to come, and I met them in the parking lot, walked with them inside, sat with them in the service, watched our welcome, again, did everything from their perspective. Like, this is my friend. It changed how I view how guest friendly and guest thoughtful we needed to be as a church, from song selection to parking to signage to making sure we have a clear, consistent welcome, because every single Sunday is someone's first Sunday. And so when I carried the weight of my friend being there, it totally shifted. And so not only has that shifted me, but I've encouraged our staff and our volunteers to do the same thing, but also to just remember that every single Sunday is someone's first time. So like this Sunday, these pastors who are listening, they're going to have a first time guest. What does that first time guest need? And how important is it to meet them where they are so you can proverbially hold their hand as you walk them closer and closer to Christ? So just that mind shift away from, I know it's normal, like we're We know everything about our church backwards and forwards. It's mundane and repeatable. But like for a first time guest, it's all brand new. So what are they seeing
It
and
is.
sensing from their perspective? And how can you serve them and tailor it for them in a more powerful way?
Well, Amy, I love that church. I also love Sean's name, and he spells it the right way, which is good. But what an encouraging story about some of the impact that small shifts can make in our strategy.
Yeah, I agree. Great pastor, great church. And so now let's just build off of what Sean shared. And Sean Bublitz and I will give you a few things to think about to maximize the potential of your weekends. So before I dive in, just let me go back to the story I started with at the beginning of the webinar, my husband and my experience back in 1998. The church we attended, they definitely created an experience that drew us in. Their front door, their weekend service was warm, welcoming, and just what our tired, spiritually disconnected family needed. However, if I take a step back from that, what they really did right is what I believe can be the biggest barrier to the front door of the church if we aren't careful. They actually raised up a congregation that cared about people far from God. Because if I back that story up just by a few months, the real reason we even walked through those doors was because I had a coworker that became my friend first. We had shared lunches, got together with one another's husbands. In fact, she and her husband offered to babysit our firstborn when me and my husband just were so tired and needed a night out. She empathized when we had an unexpected third child, knowing that our young marriage was already struggling. So I just say all that because she knew me. So when she invited me to her church, I was open to it. And eventually we said yes to that invitation. And then the rest is history. So my first tip, if I could call it that, is just to ensure you envision your congregation to care about people outside the faith and church. Remind them of your mission. Tell stories about the people you're inviting to church. I think it's a best practice at least once a year to re-envision your church around the mission of your church. The second tip is really to be, it was funny as Sean shared bringing a friend to his church, you have to be intentional about what you say and what you don't say. Let me start with what you don't say. If you don't know this, historically, the church has used a lot of words that regular people have no idea what they mean. I was secret shopping a church a few years ago, many years ago, actually. And I was greeted by this very nice church leader, and she was giving me directions for something, and she said it was just past the narthex. I don't know what a narthex is. Nominally church people, definitely unchurched people, maybe some of us on the webinar today, we don't know what a narthex is, what a sanctuary is, what it means to be sanctified. At another church, I met their assimilation pastor. I don't want to be assimilated. That's a weird word. And by the way, even some of the words that we feel are actually quite normal can be weird. Let me pick on the word group. Again, I was secret shopping at church, a very healthy, very effective church. But after the service, I went to the area that they said I should go to if I was new. And the person I met kept saying, you should get in a group. And finally, I was like, what's a group? In other words, we use normal words, but we don't use them in a way that normal people understand them. So, I mean, communication can be difficult enough when we all know what the words mean, but you throw in a few churchy words, and it's really to the exclusion of the people you're trying to reach. So pay attention to how you say what you say. Be clear, be normal.
Yeah, that's good. Amy, can I jump in here too? Because I think this is a good segue to the church's kind of digital front door also. And when I say digital front door, really what I mean is your website. So let's talk about your website for a second. I think the website is one of those critical strategies, reach strategies that you have to get right. I mean, think about it. We rarely go anywhere in person anymore without researching online first. Let me talk about when churches get this wrong, and then maybe when churches get this right, an example of that. When churches get this wrong, I think they actually create barriers for new people, similar to what you're saying in the language there. On the website, they use insider language. So we'll see words that as a new person or as an outsider, we don't know what they mean. We don't understand those. They use pictures of people who don't maybe look like us. And so it doesn't communicate to us that this is a place for us. They might include a page about kind of the core theology of the church, but there's no information about Jesus necessarily. And of course, everything that we're trying to do is to point them towards Jesus, but that's missing from the website. They often don't list simple information that's easy to find for new people that they would be looking for. Place things as simple as our church address and times of services. Amy, I've shared this with you, but the number of church websites that I come across that don't just have something simple like our address, where we're located at, because they're just assuming that the people using the website already know that, right? And of course, new people have no idea. They need to know Google directions. Where do I drive to? What time should I be there? That sort of thing. I would include in that too, pictures of kids' spaces. So if I bring my kids to church, what does that space look like? I'm not really comfortable just putting my kids in a space that I know nothing about. So communicate some of that. You can do that through pictures and through text. So when churches get that wrong, they're missing some of those things. Now, let me flip this. When churches get this right, and I just want to brag on a church as an example here for a second. Amy, our friend Jesse Tink, he leads a great church in Iowa called Prairie Lakes Church. And I think they knocked the new guest experience out of the park on their website. So if you're interested in looking at this and seeing this, it's prairielakeschurch.org. So prairielakeschurch.org. The landing page of the website answers most, maybe all, of my questions as a new guest. There's a short video from Jesse. It's focused on new guests and tells more about who they are at Prairie Lakes. So I get to see the pastor. I get to learn more about the church. It's very easy to find locations and times and information about kids, information about parking. Where do I go? What's the service like? And when it comes to a website designed for new guests, this one's just a home run. So those are some of the things that churches get right. And go to that website, check it out, see what you can learn from them. I think they did a really great job. A well-designed website, that digital front door for the church, can help people make a decision to visit. But then after that, you need a great experience for them, right, Amy? So can you talk a little bit about the experience once they get there?
Yeah, let's move into the actual weekend experience now. I'll call that tip 3. This will be tip 4. We've talked a lot on past webinars and our podcast about the importance of guest services. So I'm not going to delve deeply into that. But when it comes to guest services, you need to make sure you have greeters and ushers, your first impressions people. You need to make sure they have a good EQ, meaning they don't over or under greet, and make sure some of them look like the people you're trying to reach. In other words, make sure your guest services is multi-generational, not just one generation. Sean, I can't remember who said this recently. Might be my husband. But basically, at their go time, after they hold their volunteer huddle before church starts, they tell their first impressions team, talk to people, not name tags. In other words, make sure you're giving your attention to the people at your church, not the people you're serving alongside. I just think that's really good. Tip number 5, if your primary mission field is to reach the next generation, so parents with young kids, then your children's pastor needs to be freed up in the morning to be greeting new families. I say this often to pastors. You might have the title children's pastor, but you're primarily a team builder, and you're the face of the ministry. So being a team builder means you're raising up other people to run kids ministry. Kids pastors should not be in the rooms, behind tables, running around coordinating things. Rather, they should be freed up to meet new families, look for new families, and engage with them. And then this final one, Sean, I'll wrap it up with tip number 6. This is actually the easiest one, the easiest thing to do. And it's also the most frequently missed. But I really believe you need to put people at ease within the first 5 minutes of them sitting down in your auditorium. We have to remember that they're in a foreign environment, and if they didn't come with a friend, they're by themselves, and everything around them is new. So think through these areas through their eyes. Let me start by addressing pre-service communications. The most common thing that I see these days is using pre-service slides to communicate things to the church. And again, I would just ask the question, are you speaking to new people at all during that time? Most churches that I see, they just have slide after slide of different activities and programs that are going on in the church. And that's not all bad. Even new people are interested in what type of activities that you have. But you have an opportunity here to voice a few slides to new people, again, to put them at ease and let them know that, hey, we're expecting you. And then the last thing under this umbrella of putting people at ease in the first 5 minutes, make sure you welcome new people at the top of your service. this is really the easiest thing that gets missed all the time. If I've said it once, I've said it a million times. Most churches just dive right into the music. The worship
Right.
leader says, let's stand. And then 25 minutes later, someone finally welcomes new people. We have to remember outside the church, people don't sing with other people in not too many places. They don't know any of the music, most likely, and they have no idea how long they're going to be standing and singing. So to alleviate all of this unknown, wouldn't it be great if just as the music started, the worship leader said something like, welcome to Grace Church. I'm Amy. If you're new with us this morning, we're so glad you're here. We're going to start our time together with a time of singing. We invite you to sing along or just feel free to take it in. We're just glad you're here. Can everyone please stand? Completely different experience for a new person. So what that does is it gives new people, some cues as to what to expect.
Yeah, this is really good, Amy. And I think it's really timely because Easter's coming up right now. And churches are likely going to have new people at these services. It's just a great time to do an audit on how well you're putting people at ease in those first 5 minutes, and an audit of some of the other areas that you talked about. All right, before we move on to our next conversation on retaining new people with the right next steps, take a look back over your workbook list of ways to maximize the opportunity for your weekend service to be that front door to connecting with your church. Does anything jump out at you as something you need to commit to changing? I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to skim over it and make any notes you need to, and then we'll be back with part 2. Okay, let's move on to part 2 of today's webinar. Amy, can you tee up this second conversation with a church leader that we've really been impressed with on developing the right next steps to retain people?
Yeah, I think it's important as we tee up this conversation to highlight the question you asked. How do we develop the right next steps to retain people? So the focus is not on the big next steps we want people to take on the discipleship path, although it's connected to that. What we're really talking about is how do we help people take their first steps of engagement? How do we help them become known? Because until we know them, it's very hard to help them take those big steps on our discipleship pathway. So for clarity with our language, I just often call these engagement steps. How do we help people with their first steps of engagement? Because if we do that right, we're much more likely to see people taking the bigger steps that we want them to take so that they can look more like Jesus.
Yeah.
So when we talk about engagement steps, we often say you want to think low time commitment and low relational commitment. I think it can feel like a really big step for people to move from a seat in the auditorium to a small group or to a serve team. Maybe it's even a big step to go to a 2-hour class or commit to a 3-week class. So we need to think about this and just what are those first low commitment, low relational commitment steps we can help them take. And by the way, our Unstuck Church report from this quarter revealed that churches of all sizes are struggling with these first steps because the numbers of people taking big steps are lagging behind weekend growth. So in other words, on average, churches are growing by 15% right now, but the big next steps of serving, getting connected in groups are not growing at that same level. So I think churches of all sizes can and are struggling with developing next steps people will actually take. And again, it's connected those first steps of engagement to taking the big ones. So big intro, but to kick off this topic of retaining people, I want to introduce you to our friend, Shelley Dameron. Shelley is the Executive Director of Ministries at Orchard Church in Brighton, Colorado. She and her husband, Doug, planted Orchard 20 years ago. And back in November, I remember if you remember this, Sean, but Doug reached out to me to share some new ways they're trying to engage more people, help people become known. And he shared some incredible results. Well, Shelley, she's the architect of those changes. And so I wanted her to share those changes with all of us today. So let's share that conversation now. Well, regarding the next step strategy at your church, how you get people engaged and taking their next steps, I'd like to hear a little bit about what you were doing before you made some of the recent changes you made. And if you can share any way that you knew like how it wasn't working, what were the indicators it wasn't working?
With Orchard being mainly a conversion growth church, so we've really been leading people to Jesus, and we see about 140 people say yes to Jesus every week. We've been in the top 10 in the nation on everything that has to do with reach. So salvations, baptisms, first-time guests, but we're not average at anything. Because it's mainly conversion growth, we can lag behind in next steps. So people serving, giving, getting in a small group, things like that. We could just make an excuse for it, right? Like, okay, we're good at reaching people, we're not so good at the other. And we've really just know how important it is for people to grow spiritually. And so instead of saying, okay, we're okay with not being so good at next steps, we're like, we have to be twice as good at trying to get, people that just said yes to Jesus to take a next step. Because people that are believers, they'll come in and be like, okay, where do I give? Where do I serve? How do I join a group? But people that just said yes to Jesus, they don't even know they need to do those things. And so trying to bridge that gap has been a challenge since we started Orchard. When we felt called to plant a church, we felt called to a really good weekend service, small groups, and one-on-one discipleship. So we used to do one-on-one discipleship, and I still believe it's the best way to disciple somebody, but we realize that if nobody will do it, it's no longer effective. And so we realized that most of the people that would sign up for that were already believers and actually should be discipling others. And the people that were brand new were too scared to jump in and be a part of that. And so it really made us start rethinking our discipleship strategy. Through the evolution of that, we realized as well that one of our biggest catalysts to get people to take next steps was a starting point class that we would have once a month, and it would be during one of our services. It'd be about an hour. And back, in the 2017, 2018, I'd have 60 people come once a month to do that. And we realized that if they did that, they would join a group, they would start serving, and they'd stick and stay. And we even looked 7 years later at those people that went to Starting Point were still involved and active in the church. Even 7 years later, it was 80, 90%. And so we realized that was a huge catalyst to help people take next steps. But then as we got into the COVID era and post-COVID, while our growth, our percentage growth was around the same, the amount of people that would go to that class went drastically down. And we were having maybe 7, 8 people come to this 1 hour class. And while the effectiveness was still good, though, 90% of them would take a next step. But when you only have a very small pool, it's not very effective. So once again, a great strategy, but if nobody will take part of it, it is no longer effective.
Right.
So we started to realize that the people that would go to that 1 hour class, they were the people that were coming to the first service, because we'd have it in the middle so people could go to it and then they could go to church and then the class, or they could go to the class and then church.
Sure.
And
makes sense.
Yeah. And we were realizing that the people that would go to this 1 hour event were the people that had come to the early service and they were just there. And so we were like, okay, obviously if they're here, they're new, they're willing to go. And we also got a lot of feedback that an hour was a lot. I mean, we live in Denver, Colorado. We have beautiful mountains. We have the Broncos. We have the Nuggets. We have the Avs. I mean, people come here to enjoy all those beautiful things, and they're not going to say no to that so that they can come to our Next Steps class, right? So we started thinking that maybe if we did a 15-minute more, we call it an event after every service, that we could it might make a huge difference. So while we all took a deep breath and said, are we willing to commit to 15 minutes after every service? We were like, the benefits of it could really outweigh the challenges of doing something after every service. So our mindset changed. We trimmed down everything. We kind of made it a what's in it for you. And it's really about the importance of community.
Mm-hmm.
The way that the class is structured is we sell it to people that if you're new here, or if you've come here for 10 years and you've never taken a next step, we want to encourage you to join the Next Steps experience. And it's just 15 minutes. You can leave your kids in class. We're going to give you a free combo cookie. We're going to tell you a little bit about our church and how you can become a part of it. And so that's our sell. And then it's literally only 15 minutes. We really usually get done in like 10 to 12. And we have our groups and director that she runs it, and she's very community driven and very, very loving and welcoming. And she hosts it, but there's a 7-minute video by our lead pastor on the importance of connection, and that we want to make it super easy for them to get connected and to make friends. And the best way to do that is by joining a serving team or getting in a small group. And then we ask them to commit to take one next step out of that class or event. And from that, we, instead of only having, 10 or 12 a month, we jump to having 10 to 12 a service, every service.
So do the math for me. How many is that per month?
So we average around 80 to 100 a month that will stop at Next Steps experience. And we have a very robust follow-up, most of it automated after that. And based on what they decide that they are going to do. So some people will mark serving, some people will mark small group, a lot of people will mark both, and then some people mark not sure. And based on how they self-select is how we follow up with them. And it has been a huge catalyst. We have seen so much growth because of doing that. Because to me, and I think really for all of us and probably our listeners right now, it's not so much about people coming to that event. It's whether or not they take a next steps out of it. That's the win, right? So if we had 100 people a month that came to Next Steps experience, but if none of them got in a group or a serving team, how effective is it? What have we really accomplished? We've really accomplished nothing. And so taking this last year to measure the effectiveness of the Next Steps experience really has been exciting. We've had a 38% increase in people joining a group. We've had a 51% increase in baptisms. We've seen a 70% increase in new volunteers, and a 33% increase in overall volunteering. And so, and it really has put our numbers really close to the average. So we might actually be average at something. So it's been really, really exciting. But we had a 174% increase of attendance in our Next Steps experience.
That's absolutely incredible. I know everyone just leaned in when they heard your volunteer numbers, because that still continues to be a hard bounce back from COVID. Well, I wanted to interview because I'm so proud that I love how you even think and talk about let's evaluate the strategy based on the results, not based on anything else. And you hold loosely to that, and you mixed it up, and you're seeing incredible differences. The last thing I want you to talk about, Shelley, is when I first heard your story, you were sharing how this strategy, moving from a 1-hour class to a 15-minute experience, really started to draw out your Gen Z and millennial attenders. Can you share about that and why you think that is?
Well, to piggyback on the Next Steps experience, we also changed up our one-on-one discipleship, and we moved to an automated, you can text Jesus to this number, and we send you 5 10-minute videos, one a week for 5 weeks. And there's a really robust resources that go along with that. Most of them are YouVersion studies. So it's all free. It's all digital. It's easy. And it's also easy for them to take next steps out of it. So we put in the links, like the one on baptism, we're going to send you a baptism link so you can sign up right then and there. And the idea behind that has been that Gen Z, they don't like to learn in a classroom anymore. They're used to learning on their own time in their own space. You know, if they come up with an issue, what are they going to do? They're going to YouTube it. They're going to watch a 10-minute YouTube video and learn that way and get their questions answered. And so this is kind of our answer to the YouTube video, you know, the Christian answer to it. And what they want to do is they want to learn at their own pace digitally, but then they want to come together and either practice what they learned or ask questions about what they learned. And you think about that practically, it's really beautiful because we can send them these awesome online free digital resources straight to them. They can watch it on their own time, at their own pace, but then they can come to church and practice it by living it out by joining a serving team, or they can join a group and get their questions answered. And so when you study Gen Z and how they learn, we're really trying to adjust our model to them. And honestly, when you look at a lot of our serving numbers, a lot of that is attributed to Gen Z. I mean, we have so many Gen Z volunteers from, you know, our teenagers, like youngins, to, you know, our mid-20s, and they just love volunteering more than some of the previous generations. And they're making a huge impact. And I just want to encourage our listeners to really be diving into Gen Z because they have so much to offer and they're ready and they're willing.
Yeah, what I love about your story is you kind of going to starting point was kind of a next step before. And it seems to me like this next step experience is really just a smaller engagement step that can get them to the bigger next steps. And so you're engaging all these people because, well, you're getting them to take the next steps and serve because you had an engagement step that suddenly opened the floodgates for you.
Absolutely.
Well, Doug and Shelley are a great example of what can happen at church when, as leaders, you're willing to kind of experiment and take time to measure the results and the outcomes, right?
Yeah, I agree. Great pastor, again, great church. But let's build on that with a few thoughts about what stood out from their strategy and maybe some other tips in here. Sean, what Orchard does well is they know their numbers, right? Mm-hmm. They had goals of defined success. And when they weren't hitting those goals, they reevaluated the strategy of how they were trying to achieve those goals. In other words, they held loosely to the strategy, tightly to the goal. So my question for our participants today, do you know your numbers? Are you setting your goals before locking into a strategy? Because bottom line, your data is telling you a story about your ministry strategies. For Shelley and the Orchard team, they weren't okay with their results. And the muscle they've developed there is that when they aren't seeing the results they want, they just put a spotlight on the strategies and make changes, right? Her example, prior to the shift, 7 to 8 people were attending a 1-hour class once a month. Now, 80 to 100 people a month are going through a 15-minute next steps experience. So do you know the target? Are you evaluating your strategies? The second takeaway for me is that I was alluding to it in the intro here. The results of your first steps of engagement are directly tied to the results you're seeing in the big next steps you want people to take. By going from having 148 people a year take a starting point class to 852 people going through the next steps experience, they saw a 335% jump in people taking next steps. That included 38% increase. If you remember, she said in joining small groups, a 51% increase in people being baptized, 70% increase in new volunteers, and a 33% jump in volunteering overall.
That's awesome.
Is your first step or steps easy, accessible, effective? This is going to be critical to discipling the people at your church. Third takeaway, I love their observations on how Gen Z learns. this digitally native generation has grown up getting content and consume it at their own pace. They prefer this as a next step. And this is where they're comfortable. Face to face will follow. That is still the goal, but it's often not their first step. I think it's important for us to remember that. A few months ago, Sean, we did a podcast called The 90s Called. And in it, we said the 90s called, they want their 12 weeks, 3-hour class back. And I think Orchard's results support this. So today, that first step experience that puts you in a classroom around tables with people you don't know, and in some cases where they require you to have a deeply personal conversation, well, the numbers are showing that this may be an outdated strategy.
Yeah. And Amy, at the end of the day, we have to remember what Paul wrote about in 1 Corinthians 12, right? The church is the body of Christ. The win is people help people meet and follow Jesus to help them find their place, their role in that body of Christ. And it's not attending a class or necessarily becoming members. And Orchard painted a great picture of how to get people connected with their local body. As we close out this conversation, I want you to take a look back over your workbook list of ways to rethink your next steps for engaging people in the life of the church. Does anything jump out at you as something that you need to commit to changing? Take the next about 20 seconds, skim over it, make any notes, and then a short message from today's event sponsor, Text in Church. We'll be here before we begin our live Q&A together.
Way too much time.
Getting more done than, I'm sorry.
Part of the impact made
you like, what?
Seriously, the...
Shit, this is already not going with.
Wow, already.
Wonder if I should...
That's funny. That's how you and I feel on a podcast sometimes, Amy.
I know. I was thinking the same thing.
Over and over. Hey, I want to say thank you to Sean and to Shelley just for sharing their stories. It is so good to hear just what's effective at some real local churches right now. I appreciated how Shelley shared that there were some things that were effective kind of before the pandemic, and that's shifted, and there's some things that are more effective now. So just to hear, and especially the great results that they've experienced, it's really encouraging, but it's very helpful, I think, because it's practical. So huge thanks to both of them for sharing their stories today. Amy, we've got several questions here that came in from the viewers throughout the webinar. I'd like to go through these, and we can maybe just kind of bounce these off of each other. I'll pitch the question out there, and we can just spend some time discussing. And then if you're still tuned in today and you have other questions, I'm monitoring the Q&A right now. So if you send in a question, I'll try to grab that as well. So one question that came in, Amy, do you recommend making a distinction between an on-ramp or pathway? So kind of those smaller next steps and then the bigger next steps, and a discipleship pathway? Or do you recommend that they are kind of one and the same, and any examples you can share? So, I mean, what Shelley just talked us through is a great example of that. But
I personally really have been talking about it differently over the past few months. I think what Shelley was talking about today with the next steps experience, I think that is what I'm calling engagement pathway these days. What are the first 2 or 3 next steps that we want people to take? Our colleague Chad often talks about, people come to the weekend service and that's kind of the top of the funnel. And then what you really want from there is that they come back again, right? So how do we intentionally help people move from being a first-time attender to a returning guest type of thing? That's part of that engagement pathway. And then I think what Shelley described today with this next steps experience is really maybe the next notch down on that funnel, because they're just slowly walking into the water, right? So with the next steps experience just being 10, 15 minutes, it's really their opportunity to become known. And people need to become known typically before they take the big steps onto what I would then call at the bottom of that funnel, the discipleship pathway, whether that's getting baptized or whether that's getting into serving, as she mentioned, or groups, or learning to become generous. So it's really engagement is the pathway to the pathway. Engagement is the pathway to the
Yeah.
discipleship steps. That's how I've been talking about it. And I think it's helpful to clarify that, because it also puts a spotlight on the engagement piece. Because if we do the engagement piece right, and that's all the data that Shelley shared, it has an impressive impact if people are engaging, impressive impact on people actually taking those next steps.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great answer, Amy. I've got nothing to add that would be helpful on top of that. Good job. Here's another question. We're having more and more families that want to keep their kids with them, even though we offer high octane gospel centric kid experience. How can we better engage those families and meet their desire for a more unified family experience? That's a challenge I've heard at, not from every church, but from a couple of churches.
Yeah, again,
Any
I think
thoughts
it
on
comes, I still think the best practice is to get kids in environments where they can understand and be really engaged, where the content is really catered to their stage of learning, their stage of life, and to get the the adults in an environment that's catered to them. And so the best practice that I see is 12 and up in the big church, and birth through fifth grade into a kids environment that's really designed for them. Put resources into that, make it for kids. So, but back to his question, or her question, about more and more families want to go to church together. It makes sense to me, because family time is so compressed these days, and people probably like to stay with their kids. Unfortunately, it's probably not the best experience for their kids. And so I think vision casting and reminding people why we have these environments, that we really want to cater this to your children, make it a benefit for their children to be in those environments. And of course, you can have family rooms if you've got venues or locations on your site. But what happens is there's just a lot of distraction. And then I don't think anyone is really served well. You're there together as a family. But I know for me, when I had my little ones in church with me the first weekend we went, I was parenting. I wasn't locked in. So I wasn't gaining
100%.
anything, and they weren't gaining anything. So envisioning, and make sure you invest well in your kids' areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know me, Amy, I've got 5 kids myself. And with our younger kids, if I brought them into the service with me, it would be, I might pick up bits and pieces of the services we go through, but most of it, I'm going to be parenting. I'm going to be focused on whether they're being a distraction to the people around them. I'm going to be worried about those types of things. And so I'm not going to get a lot out of it personally. It's been my experience that in those situations where parents want to bring their kids in, like you said, family time is compressed, but there's still some kind of trust issue that exists with the church. And I would want to dig into that more and figure out, is that a part of the reasoning that people are bringing their kids into service with them? And of course, parents today, I mean, there's a lot to mistrust any institution about, right? We hear about that all the time. So it's harder and harder to gain their trust. But I think it's worth the work to do that, because it's better experience for the kid. It's a much better experience for the parent too, right?
Yep.
All right. This is a fun question, Amy, because you and I probably both have some energy around this. How do you feel about the 30 to 60 second greeting time during a service, the turn and greet someone around you, which this doesn't have maybe as much to do with reach, but I think it does have something to do with retain, actually.
Yeah. I'm an extrovert. I love people. I don't mind saying hello to strangers. So I personally don't have this repellent, but I am not everybody is like me. And I do agree. I think for our introverted friends, people who have not been put at ease yet in the service, we haven't even welcomed them. And now you're asking me to meet a person, shake a hand. Again, post-COVID, there's a little more, there's still an aura around that of, shaking hands or physical touch. I probably wouldn't recommend it, even though I know a lot of churches do it, and it feels like it can be just an easy way to friendly and connect people, but I'm just not sure what purpose it serves. What do you think?
Yeah. I was working with a church recently and had attended their service, and they asked me about it specifically. It was one of the things I think they'd been discussing. And I said, it's really difficult for me as an outsider and somebody who's new to then, I see a lot of people who I think are a part of your church. They're there probably every Sunday. They know each other, they're engaging with each other, and they may be intentional to come by and shake my hand and say hi, but it's still pretty awkward experience for me as someone who's newer. So I would encourage you actually not to do it and do something different instead. And it was interesting, the introverts in the room, the people like me, were all like, oh, thank goodness. And even the majority of the extroverts raised their hand and said, I'm an extrovert, but even I don't really like that. So I think what I've found is that for the churches, at least that I've talked to about this, there's a very small percentage of people that really feel like they get something out of that. And if it's that much of a distraction, it's probably not worth even 60 seconds of your service at this point. But again, that's my opinion. Amy, there was one more question. I know we're at time here, so if you have been viewing the webinar today and need to leave, completely understand that. We're at time, but I wanted to just address one more question because it's right up our alley, it's right in our lane, and I think this is a really good question that would be helpful. I mentioned to know your numbers. We talked about that in the story of Orchard Church, and establish goals and targets. What primary metrics or ratios would you suggest to focus on?
Well, we often say one metric doesn't tell you much about the health of your church, and one metric, maybe two don't, three don't. So we encourage churches to look at a series of metrics on kind of the reach side of your effectiveness and your health, and a series of metrics on the kind of the discipleship, spiritual formation side. So with our vital signs, I'll probably miss a few, but obviously comparing attendance year to year is important. Are we growing? Are we declining? You need to know that. How many new people are you adding to your database every year? That's going to tell you if you have a front door or a back door problem, if you aren't growing. Online is important. We do a 1 minute, you have to pick a online metric. Ours is views 1 minute or less. Compare that to last year, because what the data is showing us now is that churches that are growing also have online that is growing. So they are correlating now in the years that we've been tracking this since 2020. Also, the number, it's different by different churches, but either baptisms, salvation, some way to know, are people actually saying yes to following Jesus, and comparing that. A mix of those metrics will give you some perspective on the reach side of your ministry. On the spiritual formation, it's usually around your big discipleship next steps. So it's around serving, how many people are serving. You can do the percentage. We have a benchmark of around 50% is the benchmark, that we want 50% of our average weekend attendance showing up in our serving numbers. Groups, how many people are getting connected in groups. Some type of giving metric is important. I don't find per capita giving especially helpful, even though it's in our Bible signs right now, but because that's so different around the country. If we compared, Seattle or kind of the West Coast churches with East Coast churches versus Middle America, just pay and all that is different, but some sort of metric that helps you understand, are we increasing in generosity or are we decreasing there? And then I think the other important one is around volunteer leaders. How many people in our church that are volunteers are leading other people? Because we find that even churches with high percentages of people serving, they also are very overstaffed because they don't have those volunteer leaders in place. So a mix, something like that on the spiritual formation side, will give you the snapshot of health there. And then, of course, looking at it all together, it'll help actually show you where are we winning and where are we kind of falling behind. And our vital signs assessment is available through our learning hub. And you can, we encourage churches to take it at a minimum annually. And that it's a sample of that we do all of our Unstuck Church reports with, which, let me just make a plug. Our Unstuck Church survey that's coming out this quarter, I would really love all of you to take it. It's going to be on staffing. And this is probably one of the most anemic areas that we have comparable information church to church. So when you see that email, please take a few minutes to complete it for us.
Absolutely. And if you're a listener to our podcast, you know that we've offered just recently free access to that vital signs assessment.
Yeah.
So if you don't listen to the podcast, you might want to start, and I'd recommend going back and listening to some episodes so you can get free access through the podcast. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. This has been a great conversation. Great to hear from a couple of churches that are really experiencing great results and have some practical ideas and strategies to help us as we reach and retain more people. It's an important conversation leading up to Easter, but this is an important conversation all the way around. One of the quickest ways to get stuck as a church is to become inwardly focused. And so if we're not reaching those who are outside the church and faith, it's going to lead to maintenance and stuckness in the long run. So again, thank you for engaging this conversation with us. We will send the video replay out in the coming days. use that workbook to kind of continue this conversation and answer some questions with your team. And again, if we can do anything to help or serve your church, we're here. You can reach us at theunstuckgroup.com. Until next webinar, we hope you're well and we're cheering for you in ministry. We'll see you in the future.